Carlos Acosta was taken out of court in handcuffs to serve 6 months in the county jail, along with being put on probation for 30 months. He has to make a $1,000 contribution to a child advocacy center and do 200 hours of community service. He was found guilty of not doing his job as the DCFS caseworker assigned to investigate the abuse of AJ Freund. 5-year-old AJ died in 2019. His parents are in prison for his death. His mother was a heroin addict. Acosta was accused of ignoring the signs of abuse, and that led to the boy's death.
I am not the lazy, uncaring monster that Patrick has portrayed me to be. I am a social worker. I have lived in and served my community for the last 20 years.
Judge George Strickland said he has already suffered consequences.
He has been shamed. He's lost his job. He'll never work in this area again, and he's now a convicted felon. But that in and of itself is not enough, which is why I've ordered his incarceration.
He was 5. Just 5 years old. A boy with a name, AJ Freund. A child whose laughter once echoed down the quiet streets of Crystal Lake, Illinois. A child who, by all outward appearances, lived the kind of life most wouldn't question. There were toys in the yard. A dog in the house. A mother. A father. A family. On April 18, 2019, that illusion shattered. That morning, AJ was reported missing by his father. The tone of the 911 call, measured, careful, void of panic, raised a quiet alarm in those who heard it. The search began immediately. Neighbors walked the blocks. Police combed the area. Flyers were posted on streetlights and telephone poles. Helicopters circled overhead. Cameras flashed. Reporters gathered. Everyone was asking the same question: where was AJ? As the hours turned into days, concern gave way to suspicion. The story didn't add up. There were gaps in the timeline. Hesitations in interviews. Contradictions that couldn't be explained away. And then came the breakthrough.
AJ died in 2019.
One that would unravel every carefully constructed lie. But to understand what happened in that house on Dole Avenue, we need to go back. We need to look closely. Because the truth is, AJ wasn't just lost. He didn't wander off. He didn't vanish into the woods. What happened to him was methodical, deliberate, and entirely preventable. This is the case of AJ Freund. A case that forced an entire state to confront the failures of the very institutions designed to protect children. A case that exposed what happens when people look the other way. A case that left a 5-year-old buried beneath the cold soil of Woodstock, wrapped in garbage bags, stripped of warmth and dignity. For years, there were warnings. For months, there were signs. And in the end, there was silence. Stay with us, because by the time we're done, you'll be asking the same question everyone is still asking today. Why didn't anyone stop this? Why didn't anyone save him? Crystal Lake, Illinois. A town with manicured lawns and tidy sidewalks. The kind of place where neighbors wave across driveways, and children ride their bikes past rows of mailboxes. It was the middle of April in 2019, and the first signs of spring were beginning to stir. Trees budded. Grass brightened. It was the kind of town where bad things weren't supposed to happen. AJ Freund lived at 94, Dole Avenue, a white, single-story house with peeling paint and shuttered windows. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But inside those walls, the air was heavy. The rooms told a story no child should ever be part of. Andrew Freund Sr., AJ's father, was 61 years old. A former attorney, disbarred years earlier, and now a man caught in the slow collapse of a broken home. Joanne Cunningham, AJ's mother, was 36. Her past was marked by addiction, volatility, and the kind of chaos that doesn't just follow a person, it defines them. They were not new to the system. From the very beginning, AJ's life was complicated. At birth, he was removed from his parents' custody after testing positive for opiates. The signs were there. Right away. But less than 2 years later, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, returned him home. The justification? Improvement. The reality? Neglect never left. Between 2015 and 2018, DCFS received multiple calls. Neighbors described a filthy home. Others heard yelling. AJ himself told a doctor he was being hurt. But time and time again, caseworkers arrived, took notes, snapped photos, and left. Nothing changed. If anything, it got worse. In December of 2018, AJ was taken to the hospital. A large bruise stretched across his hip. He said it came from his mother. The doctor reported it to DCFS. The caseworker came. He looked at the family dog. And the report was closed. No further action. 3 months later, AJ was dead. April 14, 2019. It started with something small. AJ had soiled his underwear. A moment that for any other child would have meant an awkward cleanup and a lecture. But in the Freund house, mistakes were punished. Joanne Cunningham forced her son into a cold shower. 20 minutes. No warmth. No mercy. When it was over, she beat him. Bruises. Head trauma. Pain that no 5-year-old should ever know. And then, she sent him to bed, soaked, shivering, naked. He never woke up. The next morning, Andrew Freund Sr. claimed he found AJ unresponsive. But instead of calling 911, instead of trying to revive his son, he picked up his phone and searched the internet, child CPR. The hours that followed were filled with panic, but not for AJ's life. For their own. They cleaned. They lied. And they made a plan. AJ's lifeless body was wrapped in plastic bags. They drove to a remote area near Woodstock, Illinois, and dug a shallow grave in the dirt beneath a small tree. No coffin. No ceremony. Just silence, and earth, and the stench of fear. 4 days later, on April 18, Andrew picked up the phone and called 911. He told them his son was missing. He said AJ must have walked out in the middle of the night. He even sounded concerned. On the surface, it looked like a tragic accident, a little boy lost in the night. The public rallied. Volunteers formed search teams. Law enforcement launched drones. Joanne Cunningham appeared in front of cameras, wiping away tears, pleading for help. But investigators were watching closely. Inside the house, officers found blood stains. On a phone, they found a video, recorded months earlier. In it, AJ lay on a mattress, bruised, bandaged, and moaning in pain. The image was so disturbing, seasoned detectives had to pause the footage to catch their breath. That video told them everything they needed to know. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a crime. And the people responsible weren't strangers. They were the ones who were supposed to love him most. By April 24, Andrew Freund Sr. broke. He led investigators to the grave, hidden just off Dean Street in Woodstock. There, under the cold soil, they found AJ's small body, curled in plastic, face down, as if the world had turned away one final time. The medical examiner would later confirm the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. AJ's last moments were filled with pain. And no one came to help. As word spread of AJ's discovery, shock turned to fury. The town of Crystal Lake, once quiet, now roared with grief. Candlelight vigils were held on sidewalks that AJ had once walked. Strangers wept for a child they'd never met. And across the state of Illinois, a single question began echoing louder than the rest: how? How could a child known to the system be returned to the very home where he'd later be killed? The investigation, no longer focused on a search, now turned to accountability. The details began to surface, each more damning than the last. In the months before AJ's death, Joanne Cunningham had spiraled. She was hostile with neighbors, erratic in public, paranoid that someone might report her. Inside the home, her behavior had grown increasingly volatile. There were reports of screaming at all hours, of her dragging AJ by the arm, of the boy flinching when adults got too close. Andrew Freund Sr., while often described as quiet and composed, enabled it all. He didn't intervene. He didn't protect. He didn't leave. He stood by. And when it mattered most, he chose silence over salvation. DCFS had been to the house. Multiple times. They had seen the filth. They had heard the claims. But each time, the case was closed. Each time, the system stepped back instead of stepping in. Carlos Acosta, the assigned caseworker, had logged visits. He noted the bruises. He documented concerns. But he didn't remove AJ. He didn't elevate the reports. He didn't act. And above him, his supervisor, Andrew Polovin, signed off on it all. Emails between the two would later reveal a chilling indifference. The signs were there. The warnings were red, loud, and undeniable. Yet nothing happened. After AJ's body was found, the public outcry was immediate. Protesters gathered outside DCFS offices. Lawmakers demanded resignations. The governor of Illinois called for a sweeping review of child welfare protocols. The outrage wasn't just about what had happened, it was about who had allowed it to happen. Joanne Cunningham was arrested first. Charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, aggravated battery, and child endangerment. Her mugshot showed a woman hollowed out by years of rage and ruin, now forced to face the world she tried to deceive. Andrew Freund Sr. followed soon after. Charged with involuntary manslaughter, aggravated battery, and concealing a homicidal death. In court, he looked smaller than expected, his once confident posture replaced with a quiet, haunted stare. Both of them stood before a judge and admitted their roles. Joanne pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She offered no apology, no explanation. Only silence. The court sentenced her to 35 years in prison. Andrew, in a separate hearing, accepted a plea deal. He admitted to wrapping his son's body in plastic. He admitted to lying to police. He admitted to everything except the one thing that mattered most: why. For that, he offered no answer. He was sentenced to 30 years. But the courtroom was only one part of the reckoning. Carlos Acosta was charged with child endangerment, and eventually convicted. For failing to protect AJ when it was his job to do so. The public demanded more. They demanded accountability not just from one man, but from a system that seemed designed to fail. Andrew Polovin, Acosta's supervisor, was also charged. But in the end, a judge found insufficient evidence to prove his personal responsibility. He walked free. For many, that was the final betrayal. AJ's case forced DCFS to confront its own reflection. In the months that followed, policies were revised. Procedures were updated. A new oversight committee was formed. But for those who had watched this tragedy unfold, the changes came too late. In the courtroom, AJ's voice was never heard. His pain, his cries, his fear, only documented in medical reports, photos, and a grainy video that no child should ever have been part of. But in death, his name carried weight. AJ Freund became more than just a case file. More than just a headline. He became a symbol of what happens when the warning signs are ignored. When reports are buried. When silence becomes policy. And while his life was brief, the impact of his death continues to ripple outward, forcing uncomfortable conversations, exposing the cracks in the system, and reminding us all that the most vulnerable among us are often the most forgotten. This is not just the story of AJ Freund. It is the story of a system that looked away. And a boy who never should have been left alone. It began to unravel the moment investigators walked through the front door. The house on Dole Avenue no longer held the illusion of normalcy. With AJ reported missing, it became the center of a crime scene investigation. Officers noted the stench first: urine, mildew, rot. The air was thick with decay. Toys lay scattered across floors stained with dog feces. Dishes piled in sinks. Trash stacked against walls. And in the corner of a cluttered room, a mattress with no sheets, its surface darkened with old blood. They took photos. They catalogued every room. And then, they found something else. It was subtle, at first, a patch of carpet, slightly discolored. Forensic testing revealed what detectives feared: traces of AJ's blood. In the bathroom, they collected strands of hair, fragments of skin, and beneath the drain, fibers that didn't belong to any adult. It wasn't enough to charge them. Not yet. But it was enough to know. Something terrible had happened inside this house. Outside, the community kept searching. Volunteers moved through parks and creeks. Police followed up on dozens of false sightings. And Joanne Cunningham? She played the part. She held press conferences. She cried in front of cameras. She clutched a blanket. She begged the public for help finding her son. But her eyes never matched her words. To seasoned investigators, the performance was transparent. The turning point came when detectives seized the parents' phones. On Andrew Freund Sr.'s device, they found a video. Dated back to March. Recorded by Joanne. The footage lasted only 80 seconds, but what it showed was unforgivable. AJ was lying on the floor, barely conscious. His eyes swollen. His lips cracked. His voice faint. He wore bandages on his hips and wrists. At one point, he whispered something almost inaudible. "I'm sorry," he said. His breath caught. His body trembled. There was no medical help. No comfort. No urgency. Just a camera, documenting the damage. That video changed everything. Investigators no longer believed AJ had wandered off. They didn't believe he was alive. And they knew, both parents were involved. On April 24, police brought Andrew Freund Sr. into an interrogation room. He was calm at first. Measured. He repeated his story: AJ went to bed. He disappeared in the night. They didn't hear anything. Detectives showed him the video. They played it once. They said nothing. And then, they waited. He broke. Not all at once, but slowly. Sentence by sentence, the truth surfaced. He told them what happened that night. How Joanne had forced AJ into the freezing shower. How she screamed at him. How she struck him. How they wrapped his small, lifeless body in plastic and drove him miles away from home. And then he told them where. A wooded area off Dean Street, near Woodstock. A field that backed up against a rural road. Unmarked. Quiet. A place only they knew. Within hours, law enforcement arrived with search teams and dogs. They followed Andrew's directions through a clearing. And there, beneath the shallow soil, they found him. Wrapped in 2 plastic garbage bags. Curled in a fetal position. AJ Freund had been dead for 9 days. The earth was still moist from spring rain. The surrounding branches were snapped. A small mound of dirt covered the site. Nothing else marked the grave: no cross, no stone, no sign that a child had been laid to rest. Officers stood in silence. Some cried. Others clenched their jaws, rage simmering just beneath the surface. The coroner confirmed what investigators already knew. AJ had suffered massive head trauma. Multiple bruises covered his body. His cause of death was listed as craniocerebral trauma caused by blunt force injuries. He was 5. Joanne was arrested the next morning. Andrew followed hours later. The performance ended. The lies collapsed. And for the first time in days, the town of Crystal Lake exhaled. AJ had been found. But what remained now, was reckoning. The town was silent in the days that followed. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the hollow quiet of mourning, confusion, and fury. Outside the Freund home, people gathered. They left teddy bears on the front steps. Balloons. Candles. Cards written in shaky handwriting that read, "You mattered, AJ," and "We're sorry." It wasn't enough. Nothing ever would be. Inside the courtroom, the weight of what had happened began to take legal shape. Joanne Cunningham, now shackled and stone-faced, stood before the judge. Gone were the television tears. Gone was the frantic mother act. In its place stood a woman facing the full consequence of her cruelty. Prosecutors laid it out plainly. They detailed the months of abuse, the failure to seek medical care, the endless cycle of humiliation and pain inflicted on her child. The court heard about the cold showers. The beatings. The filthy house. The video. They heard about the night of April 14th, when AJ soiled his clothes and paid for it with his life. Cunningham pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. No deal. No leniency. Just a quiet admission in a hushed courtroom. She didn't explain. She didn't beg. She didn't look back. The judge sentenced her to 35 years in prison. There were no cheers. No applause. Just the echo of the gavel and the image of a mother whose hands had ended the life of her child. Andrew Freund Sr. followed months later. His courtroom appearance was different. Weaker. His frame slouched. His eyes downcast. The man who once buried his son and fabricated lies for the police now had nothing left to protect. He, too, pleaded guilty. Not to murder, but to involuntary manslaughter, aggravated battery of a child, and concealment of a homicidal death. In exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors, and his confession, the judge handed down a 30-year sentence. He will be in his 80s before he sees the outside of a prison wall again, if he lives that long. But the damage wasn't limited to two parents. Carlos Acosta, the DCFS caseworker who had visited the home multiple times, was now under scrutiny. He had seen the bruises. He had been inside that house. He had written the reports. But he didn't act. In fact, he dismissed the concerns, closed the cases, and moved on. He was charged with child endangerment and reckless conduct. The trial was tense. The evidence showed that Acosta had the authority to remove AJ. That he had been warned. That medical professionals had raised alarms. But he didn't escalate. He didn't intervene. Not once. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to probation and jail time, a symbolic punishment, many argued, for a man who had held the power to prevent a child's murder. His supervisor, Andrew Polovin, was also charged. But his case ended differently. Despite overseeing Acosta's work, and signing off on reports that ignored blatant signs of abuse, prosecutors couldn't prove that he was criminally responsible. He was acquitted. He walked out of court a free man. For the public, that was the final failure. Because AJ had been calling for help. Not with words, but with bruises, with fear, with a gaze that told doctors and neighbors and caseworkers everything they needed to know. They had all seen him. But they had left him there. In the aftermath, DCFS was gutted. Leaders were replaced. New legislation was passed requiring deeper investigations into at-risk homes. Policies were rewritten. But for many, the changes were too little, too late. At the heart of it all stood a boy. Small. Bright. Brown-haired and wide-eyed. A boy who told the world he was scared, and was ignored. A boy whose story ended in a garbage bag, beneath the dirt. But also a boy whose name forced a system to look in the mirror. AJ Freund is gone. But his name remains, etched in courtrooms, in laws, and in the hearts of those who will never forget what happens when every warning is missed, and no one steps in. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the sentences were handed down, many thought that would be the end. But it wasn't. Because cases like AJ Freund's don't end when the judge speaks. They linger. In legislation. In families. In the hearts of every mother who held her child tighter after hearing his name on the news. In every teacher who looks a little closer when a child walks in with a bruise. In every social worker who wonders what they missed. AJ's death did something that few stories ever do, it shook an entire state. It made Illinois stare directly at the cracks in its foundation. For years, the Department of Children and Family Services had operated in the shadows of bureaucracy. Endless paperwork. Caseloads so high, no one could manage them. Caseworkers pushed to sign off on visits, to close files, to meet quotas. Until AJ. Until a child with a soft voice and quiet eyes was buried under the weight of their inaction. The outrage forced change. Governor J.B. Pritzker ordered an immediate audit of DCFS operations. Lawmakers held hearings. Angry, tear-filled sessions where legislators read AJ's medical reports aloud to stun silence. New bills were drafted. Policies amended. Internal reviews mandated. They called it reform. Others called it damage control. The public called it too late. Because for AJ, there were no second chances. No corrected mistakes. At his funeral, dozens gathered. Strangers. Reporters. A few distant relatives. There were no long lines of mourners, no sprawling eulogies. Just a small casket, white and still. And silence. The cemetery was quiet that day. Overcast. Faint wind moving through the trees. One minister spoke a few words. A woman who had never met AJ left a stuffed bear at the base of the grave. No family member spoke. None had earned the right. There was something almost unbearable about it, burying a child whose entire life had been spent trying to survive the very people who brought him into this world. But even after the trials, the arrests, the reforms, the public still had questions. Why was AJ returned to Joanne and Andrew after testing positive for opiates at birth? Why were months of documented abuse ignored? Why did a video of AJ lying bruised and broken exist, and no one, not even the woman who filmed it, ever called for help? And what about the others? The children still out there. Still in homes like AJ's. Still hoping someone sees what's happening before it's too late. The uncomfortable truth is that AJ's story is not unique. Hundreds of children die in the U.S. every year from abuse and neglect. Many of them were known to Child Protective Services. Many of them, like AJ, had systems built around them that failed to act. But AJ's name became something different. His story was repeated on the floors of Congress, in training seminars for social workers, in university lectures about child welfare. He became the example no one wanted to be real. The boy whose face forced others to look inward. In the years that followed, new oversight positions were created within DCFS. Independent investigators were given the authority to audit cases. Mandated reporter training was expanded across schools and hospitals. Technology systems were upgraded to flag patterns of recurring abuse in households. It was progress. But every step forward bore his name. And yet, justice doesn't bring peace. The courtroom punished 2 people. But it didn't erase the pain that stretched across every inch of this case. The officers who dug through the cold earth and uncovered a child's remains. The medical examiner who had to write down his cause of death. The neighbors who wished they had said something louder. The teacher who noticed he flinched once and can't stop wondering if that was the moment. Joanne Cunningham will serve her 35 years in a state prison. She will likely never be free again. Andrew Freund Sr. will grow old behind bars. Carlos Acosta, once entrusted with protecting children, now carries the stain of a conviction. But AJ? His story doesn't end with prison bars. It ends with a reminder. A reminder that every bruise matters. Every report counts. And every time we look away, we risk burying another child far too soon. There are no winners in this story. Only a boy who deserved to be loved. And a world left wondering how no one heard him scream. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more gripping true crime stories. Share this video to raise awareness about AJ Freund's case and the fight for justice. Comment below with your thoughts on this heartbreaking story.